About, let me just got it here, get that out. Okay. About Bill Fletcher Jr. Bill Fletcher Jr. has been an activist since his teen years. Upon graduating from college, he went to work as a welder in a shipyard, thereby entering the labor movement. Over the years, he has been active in workplace and community struggles as well as electoral campaigns. He has worked for several labor unions in addition to serving as a senior staff person in the National AFL-CIO. Fletcher is the former president of Trans-Africa Forum, a senior scholar with the Institute for Policy Studies, and in the leadership of several other projects. Fletcher is the co-author with Peter Agard of The Indispensable Ally, Black Workers and the Formation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, 1934 to 1941. He is also the co-author with Dr. Fernando Gustafson of Solidarity Divided, The Crisis in Organization Labor and a New Path Towards Social Justice, and the author of They're Bankrupting Us and 20 Other Myths About Unions. Fletcher is a syndicated columnist and a regular media commentator on television, radio, and the web. Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Wynette. This is a pleasure to be here with you. And I have a challenging task, and I have to thank Bill Meyerson for dropping this challenging task on me. I have to discuss, and I'm looking forward to discussing, the sort of convergence of two historical movements. And I don't mean convergence in a good way. I mean a collision course between right-wing populist authoritarianism and what I'd call the Reconstruction movement. But before I get into that, I want to just preface it by this story. So a few days after the January 6, 2021 coup attempt, I was conducting a discussion with trade union leaders from a Western state, which will go nameless. And we weren't, the topic wasn't about the coup attempt, it was about some other things. But because that had happened, people were very traumatized. And so we needed to discuss this. One person, the head of a Central Labor Council, was so traumatized that he had taken a leave of absence from his position and, in fact, would not turn his camera on during the discussion at all. During the course of the discussion, what was interesting was that several people said, in effect, they didn't understand where this whole thing came from, this coup attempt. This was not the United States. What was this, et cetera, et cetera. And I listened, and then I ultimately said, but it is the United States. And there was silence. There were a number of interesting problems that unfolded afterwards, which if we have time, I'll get into. But there was silence about that. And I wanted to start there because one of the big problems after January 6th was the narrative that was articulated in much of the media that basically had been a narrative that we had been hearing in during the Trump administration, which is, this is not us. This is unrecognizable. This is something else. And the problem is that that's not true. If you look at the history of the United States from the Civil War on, you see that there's a pattern that recurs. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Reconstruction era in a moment, but the undermining of Reconstruction through naked terror, the coup in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898 that overthrew a duly elected government of populists by white supremacists, armed white supremacists. The coup attempt that was being planned in the mid-1930s after Franklin Roosevelt was elected, and during which a Marine Corps general known as Smedley Butler, you may have heard of, was contacted by an elite group of major corporate leaders who wanted him to lead something equivalent to Mussolini's March on Rome. They wanted him to lead a march on Washington to either overthrow Roosevelt or to force Roosevelt to bring him on as essentially a closet dictator. Rachel Maddow most recently has done this incredible podcast called Ultras, which deals with a plot in 1940 and 41 to overthrow the government that involved members of the US Congress collaborating with Nazi agents, that had set up military units around the country in, I think, all 50 states with a plan to launch attacks on a synchronized schedule. We've had during the 1950s the rise of the John Birch Society and various paramilitary organizations like the Minutemen and others. So the pattern is there. What was unusual about January 6th was only that they got into the Capitol, but the actual action, the coup attempt, was not unusual in the least. And it represented the most recent element of a clash between two dramatically different forces, right-wing authoritarians and people that are and remain in favor of democracy, and people of varying political tendencies. So let's go back then to Reconstruction. Reconstruction began after the Civil War. The attempt was to democratize the South, democratizing by eliminating slavery, elevating the condition of the former African slaves, as well as elevating the condition of poor whites. And so you started to see, and it's documented very well in W.E.B. Du Bois's incredible book, Black Reconstruction in America, you start to see the rise of these very progressive administrations in state after state in the South that introduce things like public education. There's the beginning of efforts towards labor legislation. There were several years of wildcat strikes that were taking place in the Reconstruction South that elevated the living standard of the former African slaves, now the so-called freedmen and freed women. And the plantocracy, which had been overthrown with the end of the Civil War, became completely freaked by this and was determined to undermine the efforts of Reconstruction, which they were very successful in doing. And they did it through a few different methods. One was through naked terror. So there were all of these unemployed, decommissioned Confederate soldiers who were mainly gangs, criminal gangs, that were brought together, organized in groups like the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of the White Camellia, to carry out terrorist attacks. And the terrorist attacks were aimed at whites who were supporting the Reconstruction governments, aimed at Blacks in general. And there was there was a second Civil War that was taking place in the South. What's interesting is that the Secret Service was deployed by Ulysses Grant, who becomes the president in 1868, as a method to suppress these white supremacists. And actually, they were fairly successful, believe it or not. But the problem was that there was no follow-through. And so these groups start reemerging like a bad case of herpes, and they come out again, and they start continued terrorist attacks. But the other thing that happens, it involves shenanigans that are carried out in state legislatures, some that will sound quite familiar, where you had the resurgence of various white supremacist outfits that began introducing race-neutral legislation that was aimed ultimately at disorganizing and suppressing the Black vote and the poor vote. In the North, the support for Reconstruction started to weaken. White people in the North were less and less invested in the democratization of the South. the Northern industrial capitalist class achieved what it had wanted through the Civil War, which was the suppression of the plantocracy, the elimination of slavery, and the elimination of a demand for free trade. Free trade having been one of the main objectives of the Confederacy, interestingly. And the Northern industrial capitalists had basically suppressed these folks, but were prepared to cut a deal with the plantocracy, which essentially came down to they would allow the plantocracy to reemerge as the governing class of the South, as long as the plantocracy went along with the objectives of Northern capital, did not try to have any greater secessionist movements, and supported U.S. foreign policy, which the plantocracy agreed to. So the end of Reconstruction that happens at with the culmination of the Grant administration and the so-called Compromise of 1876 results in the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. They had slowly been withdrawing. And it's at that point that the plantocracy, which reinvents itself as the Redeemers, that's what they call themselves. And they call this entire period after 1877 the Redemption. And this was a period of counter-revolution, as Du Bois articulates in Black Reconstruction in America. And when I was mentioning before about race-neutral legislation, it's very interesting what the Redeemers start doing. In order not to conflict with the amendments to the Constitution passed after the Civil War, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, they start introducing legislation around things like voting that include poll taxes, that include literacy tests. And in none of these does it explicitly say that this is aimed at the Black voter. But the political control of the implementation of these was left in the hands of the white supremacists. And as you can see, if you read any of the language of the debates at the time in the state legislatures, and this was demonstrated very recently in legislation that had been debated in the state of Virginia, Commonwealth of Virginia, where they were working to overturn restrictions on the rights of the formerly incarcerated to vote. And looking back at when restrictions have been put in, the legislators were very clear that this was aimed at suppressing the Black vote. But the legislation itself was race neutral. And so you started to see this happen throughout the South. And slowly but surely, the Black vote is disenfranchised. And with it, a section of the poor white vote. Now, the objective of this disenfranchisement was not simply to weaken the Black vote, but there was great fear in the South among the plantocracy that a unity of the poor white and the poor Black would again result in the reemergence of popular administrations that were pro-poor and anti-rich. And in fact, that is what started to happen in the 1890s with the emergence of the populist movement. And so Jim Crow and this virulent white supremacy was aimed at splitting this movement and ensuring the continuity of rich whites, the plantocracy, the former plantocracy, soon to be replaced by other elements of a newly rising Southern capitalist class. And so the redemption becomes the counterweight to Reconstruction and ends up becoming very dominant in the South up through the 1950s. Now, in other parts of the country, it was more complicated. The Redeemers were not very strong. There were strong white supremacist administrations in the Southwest that were aimed at suppressing Chicanos and Native Americans. There was states like Oregon, which prohibited Black people from entering the state and living there. There was segregation in other parts of the North, but in the South, and in a different way in the Southwest, it was one-party rule of the open white supremacist administrations. So we see these two things arising, and there's opposition to the Redeemer and the pro-Redeemer forces, and one source of that opposition becomes arises from part of organized labor. The organized labor was really split on the question of white supremacy. The American Federation of Labor, formed under the leadership of Samuel Gompers, initially had a position that was relatively progressive and opened its membership, its ranks, to workers of all races, ethnicities, and to men and women. But at a critical moment in the late 1890s, Gompers and others reversed their position and allow into the AFL white supremacist unions, one example being the International Association of Machinists. But there were others. There were railroad brotherhoods that were allowed in. And around that point, Gompers' entire attitude towards Black workers shifts into an approach of open white supremacy, and not just against Blacks. In the first decade of the 20th century, there was the Japanese-Mexican Labor Association in California that had been very successful in carrying out strikes and organizing, and sought membership in the American Federation of Labor. Under Gompers' signature, a letter was sent to the association, and it was sent to the Mexican members. And the letter said, in effect, if you throw the Japanese out, we'll let you in. And the association wrote back a response which was very eloquent. I'm from New York. I wouldn't have written such an eloquent response. But they wrote a very eloquent response that basically said, you take all of us in or none of us in. And they never entered into the AFL. But in the 1930s, with the development of what was first called the Committee on Industrial Organizations, and then finally the Congress of Industrial Organizations, you start to see a shift in organized labor of not just organizing all workers, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, but you start to see some unions, particularly those that were led by leftists, take a strong stand against white supremacy. And in not just in the workplace, but more broadly, unions like the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, the United Electrical Workers, the Packing House Workers, and others took very strong stands and joined with other forces in society that were beginning a counterattack against what I'm going to call the Redeemer regime. And it was so when we're looking at what comes to be known as the Civil Rights Movement, too many people think of it as starting in 1954 and 1955. I would argue that what we start to see emerging in the 50s really comes in embryo form in the 1930s and is assisted by former members of the Garvey movement, by members of the Congress of Industrial Organizations. The Communist Party played a major role, and others, in bringing about these dramatic changes. And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip forward, because we know that in the 50s and 60s, we start to see, as a result of profound social movements, changes around the world, including anti-colonial movements. We start to see the expansion of democracy in the United States, the victory of so-called civil rights, and not just for people of color, but it inspires the women's movement, the LGBTQ movement, and others, and really gets moving. In the late 1960s, there's a couple of things that happen that really have to be highlighted. So first, the 1964 presidential election brought forward a very unusual Republican candidate in the name of Barry Goldwater from Arizona. Now, the Republican Party had up until that point, a very ambiguous view on civil rights. People like Richard Nixon were viewed as pro-civil rights. There was a clear liberal wing, but as a party, it was known to be pro-business. But they had what was thought of as a liberal wing. Goldwater advances a different face, and externally very militaristic, and internally represents a mainstream assault on the victories of the civil rights movement. And thus his slogan, "In your heart, you know he's right," was a slogan targeted at white people and was aimed at saying, in effect, that you know that what he's saying about the civil rights movement going too far, et cetera, was legitimate. Now, his presidential candidacy was roundly defeated. But out of his candidacy emerged a group of people led by individuals like Richard Viguerie and Paul Weyrich, who concluded that it was not time to surrender, that it was time to really build a new right wing. And they looked at the development of George Wallace, then the governor of Alabama, and they watched the impact that Wallace was beginning to have, not just in the South, but in other parts of the country. And they made a decision to ultimately, rather than form a separate party, political party, to enter into the Republican Party and to strike an alliance in 1968 with Richard Nixon, who they despised, by the way. They looked at Nixon as a liberal and completely untrustworthy. But Nixon had brilliantly embraced the idea of what came to be known as the Southern strategy, which really should be understood as the white people's strategy. It was less about the South and more about white people. And it was basically the idea that the Democratic Party needed to be painted as the party of Blacks, and the Republican Party needed to be painted as the non-Black party. And that distinction exists with us to this day. And so Weyrich and Viguerie begin the development of what comes to be known as the New Right. And later, people like Lewis Powell, who becomes a Supreme Court justice and writes the infamous Powell memo, they begin the development of a multi-decade strategy to reverse the victories of the 20th century. And that's the way we have to understand the right-wing authoritarian movement. It is not a conservative movement in a sense of slowing down change. It's a movement that aims to overthrow the 20th century. And we very recently seen this in the proliferation of unprecedented Supreme Court decisions. Viguerie and Weyrich and others construct a three-pronged effort. One, political and legislation, litigation, and social movements. And they see this as an assault on the New Deal and on the victories of the 1950s and 1960s. And what's remarkable in this is that they begin to create, part of this was the brainchild of Lewis Powell, they start to create think tanks and PACs as ways of organizing their right-wing base into cadres and mass organizations. The mass movements that they build are brilliant because they're single issue: anti-busing, anti-abortion, pro-guns, anti-Panama Canal. The list goes on and on. And the idea is to get people into these mass struggles and not make their entrance into these mass struggles preconditioned by their agreement on any other issue. As I always say, you could get into the anti-abortion movement, but be anti-guns. You could get into the anti-busing movements and be pro-abortion. It didn't matter, because what the right understood is once you get people into these movements, you can work them. And that is precisely what they did. They began working people over many years, and through various kinds of educational efforts, beginning to control elements of the media, and ultimately to move very forcefully to take over and influence AM radio, and particularly talk radio, which becomes an important factor in the 1980s. The victory of Ronald Reagan went further than Nixon, because Nixon had been fundamentally a supporter of Keynesian economics. I mean, he was terrible on a number of things, but he was actually, believe it or not, to the left of Bill Clinton on many ways. Reagan, however, was introducing something very different, and was very subtly and not so subtly introducing a more full-blown counterattack on the 20th century. And he gives space for the people like the Vigories, Wyriches, the Buchanans, and others to begin incubating various efforts. They also, during the 1980s, you start to see the rise of more openly fascist efforts in the Midwest and the Northwest. And this is in the midst of the economic crises in those regions, and particularly in the Midwest, the farmers' crisis that was devastating. And so groups like Posse Comitatus, Aryan Nation, and others began actively organizing in areas with a fascistic orientation. And when I say fascist, I'm not being euphemistic. I mean, they were talking about armed struggle. They were very anti-Semitic, and they combined, as fascists have done, the anti-Semitism with a form of anti-corporatism or anti-capitalism. So in the Midwest, they would be talking about the Jewish bankers and how the Jewish bankers were ruining the lives of the farmers and others. So we start to see, so we have this new right, we have this developing fascist force in the Midwest and in the Pacific Northwest that's emerging. The counter to that is largely based first in the Black-led electoral efforts that begin in the late 1970s and culminate in Jesse Jackson's two presidential runs in 84 and 88, the Rainbow Movements. And that became a counterattack to this right-wing force. But this counterattack does not get organized nearly as well in order to defeat the rise of these right-wing populists. Now, I've used that term right-wing populism, and I want to just define it a little bit so that we're all clear. Right-wing populism, well, first of all, populism itself is a political tendency which is neither right nor left. It's a framework. It's a framework that basically says that it's the people against the elite. So as a result, there are left-wing forms of populism and right-wing forms of populism. Right-wing populism says that there are the people versus the elite, but it tends to define the people in racial, ethnic, and/or religious terms, as it does the elite. So the people, and this is why we have to be very careful when you read something like, for example, by Pat Buchanan, that at one moment can sound like he's a Marxist, and then you turn a page and you realize, oh my God, right? There's something else that's going on here, because there's a defining of the people, generally speaking, in racial or subtly racial terms. And there is an idea, it's something that a theorist out of France named Balabar calls neo-racism, where it's not framed in terms of superiority, inferiority. It's more framed in terms of which populations are compatible with whom. And that becomes very, very important in understanding the contemporary right wing. And so these right-wing populists have basically argued that this country was founded by white people. It was founded on a basis of a white republic, that the rest of us are guests, some wanted, some unwanted, and that the basic notion of the white republic needs to be restored. But they don't stop with the white republic, because they also have this idea about gender relations and the relationship, and in that sense, very male supremacist and very much in opposition to non-gender conforming populations. In order to understand the far right today, you can think about it as, when it comes to gender and women, that they wish to suppress women and they wish to exterminate the LGBTQ plus populations. That's their basic objective. And that has been their objective all along. And so these right-wing populists they emerge at different points in US history, particularly when there are economic crises and particularly when there's financial crises. And when there are financial crises, they go Jew hunting. Right-wing populists are always looking for Jews anytime there's a financial crisis. And one of the more recent examples of this, well, it's no longer recent. In 2008, in the presidential campaign, in the midst of the financial crisis, during speeches by McCain and Palin, you'd often hear from the audience, name names. They were talking, when they talk about the financial crisis, name names. Now, when I first heard this, I said, oh, great, right? They want to start really naming these capitalists. And then I realized, oh no, danger, Will Robinson. That's not what's going on. They wanted McCain to start naming Jews and to name the Jews that they would identify as being ultimately responsible for the financial crises. And we can see how this has played out more recently. So the rise of these right-wing forces is aimed at ultimately destroying every victory that has been won since 1912. Why 1912? It's around that era that you start to see progressive legislation that getting introduced in federal and state levels. So everything from that on, including the New Deal, the victories of the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and other movements that emerged, the Puerto Rican movement, Chicano, indigenous, etc. The idea is to eliminate that. As Grover Norquist, the father in many ways of the anti-tax movement, has argued, they want to return the United States to the era of William McKinley, i.e. 1898. And so just think about that in terms of everything that has been won since 1898, they wish to eliminate. And then if you add into that the antics and ravings of Marjorie Taylor Greene, you get an idea as to what they really seek to do, which is, I would argue, the construction of a new confederacy or a neo-apartheid situation. So, in opposition to this, there have been various efforts that have been summarized by the late Manning Marable and more recently by people like Reverend Barber as the need for a third Reconstruction. Now, what do they mean? Well, the first Reconstruction was 1865 to 1876, 1877. The second Reconstruction was not a formal period, but is usually used to describe the period from about 1950, 1954 until maybe 1973, when we had these significant victories, progressive victories that included but were not limited to civil rights. And by the mid-1970s, with the 73 recession, the major crises, the beginning of so-called deindustrialization, the emergence of neoliberalism, that whole period comes in for a landing, a crash landing. The argument for a third Reconstruction is an argument for the development of a social movement or a movement of movements that transforms the United States, that builds upon the victories of the 20th century, but goes farther. A movement that deals with the continued reality of racist oppression in the United States, the continued reality of male supremacy, the existential danger that we're facing with the environmental crises. And in general, I would summarize it as being a movement for consistent democracy. That is, for the expansion of democracy rather than a contraction of democracy. And so the third Reconstruction is basically saying whether it's the issue of workers' rights and the rights of workers to organize, the rights of workers to strike, the rights of workers to control means of production, the rights of consumers, the rights of communities to actually engage in discussions about economic development, and economic development that is pro-green, that is pro-environment, as opposed to just creating more shopping malls and destroying more forests. The rights of people to decide who they are, and their gender identification, and to be free of all forms of male supremacy, and the rights of women to decide control of their own bodies and what happens. These are the politics of the third Reconstruction, and these politics are antithetical to the neo-redeemers, the neo-Confederates. One final note, and then I want to make sure we have plenty of time for a discussion. One of the odd things about these neo-Confederates is that you actually see women and people of color in them. And it's like, I look at, I'm saying, what the hell is going on, right? These women who get on Fox News and articulate male supremacist arguments. Seeing Marine Le Pen in France, or watching Black folks speaking on, and I have a family member that falls into this category, I'm ashamed to say, that articulate these right-wing notions. I think what's important to understand is that the far right even, is not monolithic. And that within the far right, there are different tendencies that have varying ideas about different subpopulations. So there is what I call a sort of neo-apartheid wing. And if you remember the apartheid system in South Africa, at the top there were whites, and then beneath them, there were honorary whites, the Japanese. Then you had the so-called coloreds that included the South Asians and mixed race people. And at the bottom, there were the Blacks. And in the apartheid system, they would give a role for these different populations. Neo-apartheid political forces in the United States are willing to give a role for Latinos and Latinas, for African Americans, et cetera, as long as these forces will accept the dominance of the white republic. They will give a role as long as, and this helps us to understand some of the Black men that voted for Trump, as long as they're prepared to endorse male supremacy. There were a section of Black men, certainly a minority, that were enthralled by the male supremacy of the Trump period, the misogyny, the open misogyny. And it reflects the generalized crisis that we're in, where there is this loss of a sense of moorings, of who we are. And in that environment, the right comes forward and says, we're going to restore the old time religion. I would recommend that if you have never seen about the Scopes monkey trial, a brilliant film, and I'm drawing a blank on it.
Inherit the Wind.
Inherit the Wind. If you've never seen that, you've got to watch it. And there's this, the recurring song, Give Me That Old Time Religion, right? Which is so relevant to this day. as is the entirety of the film, as a matter of fact. And so what we see is the clash of these forces underway. And what we saw going full circle on January 6th was that the neo-Confederate forces have decided that it's not enough to play by the rules of the game. The rules need to be changed. So not only was January 6th a continuity since Reconstruction, but it showed us that the far right is prepared to engage in illegal armed action, that they have an armed wing. They're also prepared to do what the Nazis did in the Reichstag in the 1930s before Hitler took power, which was to destabilize the legislative branch of government and to discredit, which is part of what I would argue Marjorie Taylor Greene is attempting to do, to discredit the electoral process, to get people to be so frustrated that they're prepared to turn towards a strong man, and it will be a strong man, in order to introduce stability. And one of the things that can happen is that people can become very fearful of instability, and in those moments can often turn to very nefarious forces, which is what the far right was hoping in the mid-1930s and in the early 1940s. And so our task, as they say in Mission Impossible, should you be prepared to accept it, this is our mission, is that we've got to destroy the neo-Confederates. Now, some people get really freaked when I use that term, destroy us. Bill, what do you mean? What I mean is, non-violently, we have to make it impossible for them to ever reemerge as a significant political force in this country. And that means that we have to organize very differently. We need to learn lessons from what Vigory and Weyrich did. That is, you fight them on those three fronts: litigation, politics and legislation, and mass movements. That when, for example, the right wing shows up at school committee meetings to try to fight us on so-called critical race theory, and it's not about critical race theory, it's about history, we are there en masse. We're not sitting back tweeting. We're not sitting back texting and wringing our hands. We're there. We confront them. We double them in terms of numbers. When they show up and try to block a woman's right to decide her body, we show up. We're there. We outnumber them. I always remember in the 1980s, the Klan decided to make a visit to Boston. I was living in Boston at the time. And they decided to show up and march through the center of Boston. And there might have been a couple hundred Klans people. There were about 1,000 anti-Klan people that showed up, and we chased those guys to Logan Airport. I mean, they basically literally got run out of town. And I'm wondering, like, why aren't we doing the same thing now? When these folks show up at school committees, why aren't we running them out of town? I mean, what are we waiting for? An invitation? I mean, we're waiting for them to surrender? And so trade union movements and organizations need to be there in this battle for democracy, because that is what it is, a battle for democracy. So I'll stop there.
So we can open it up now to questions and comments. You can either chat it in or you can raise your hand, which you can do under the reactions, which for most of you should be at the bottom of the screen. Or if you want to unmute yourself, you can do that as well. Go ahead, Seth.
Thank you, Alan. Well, first, Brother Bill, I just wanted to thank you for that extraordinary and concise summary of and comprehensive summary which is really extremely helpful. I just want to mention one thing that you said that really struck my thing was that I took note of, was your comment about how the right is not monolithic, and how not in a in a true in any fair or equitable way, but they certainly, as you said, will give a role to folks who and include individuals in their movement, as you gave examples of. And that made me think about how on the left we don't I feel like we try to be monolithic, and we get in our own way in doing so. So I wonder if that's something that and if I don't think we're not trying to learn the lessons of how to be. I think we would truly want to be inclusive in a real general way, and have that based upon some real values about equity and justice, but not have these, like, maybe purity tests or whatever we want to call them, that we end up not being not being able to organize around a common goal.
Well, I agree. Now, here's the irony. The right learned from the left. The right had been the ones that had purity tests. The left traditionally had been quite broad. And obviously there's always been sectarianism, but it was much broader. What people like Vigory and Weirich understood in looking at the history of the left was that you had to break out of silos, you had to break out of purity tests, and you had to open up. So while they were learning lessons from us, and I'm thinking about the broad left and progressive movements, we were retreating. And you're absolutely right. I was very involved in forming United for Peace and Justice in 2002 to oppose the pending invasion of Iraq. And we were a very, very broad coalition. We were opposed by a group called the Answer Coalition, which was very sectarian and kept raising the bar for entry. And that's what kills us. That when you get into a situation where you're trying to build like a movement around a single issue, and then people keep introducing other issues, right, that become tests. Well, they're chasing people out. It doesn't mean you shouldn't have multi-issue coalitions, but it means that we've got to understand tactics, and that there is a value for single issue. I'll give you an example. I'm very involved right now in efforts to free Western Sahara from Moroccan domination. And we have within our coalition Republicans. And we don't agree on anything other than on Western Sahara. And we agree very strongly on Western Sahara. They know I'm a Marxist, right? They know that, and they're willing to work with me on this, right? Whereas there's some folks that would say, oh no, we can't work with anyone, that is that far to the right. And so you've got to understand that you've got to have like a level of flexibility, as long as someone is not trying to put a knife in your back. The right understood that.
Kimberly, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, I just want to say great talk, and you brought a lot of things to my mind that I had kind of forgotten from my long ago history classes. But one thing I do want to emphasize is I've been saying since Trump popped up on the scene that we are facing a fascist movement. And he is using, and now the entire right crazies are using the same tactics as Hitler when he was taking over Germany. He focused on, we have to get out of the Versailles Treaty, and we have to get our people working. And the majority of German people were like, yes, we're all 32% unemployment. And they bought into that. And then he very slowly started chipping around the edges until his anti-Semitism was in full effect and killed millions and millions of people. Well, that's what the right is doing now. And the fact that they were able to, Trump was able to pack the court with people who blatantly were against abortion, they got in the court and now abortion's gone. That is the exact same thing that happened with Hitler taking power. And it's, so many people don't understand and don't see that division that comes from closing your eyes to what's truly happening around you. And I blame all the media out there for not telling the full story. And I also understand that single topic. And I think that's something that all of the coalition, like the coalition we're working with now, needs to understand. We can't spread everything everywhere, but when we need to get people to show up and act out, it has to be around the things that motivate people, whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, people of color or whatever. There are issues that do that for people, and that's how we take back our democracy.
So the one cautionary note I'd offer is that fascism is a subset of right-wing populism. Fascism is a very radical movement. It's not simply reactionary. It's not simply against progressives. They have a radical view of the destruction of constitutional democracy. There are different trends on the right, and they are all vicious, but they're different. I don't know whether any of you have watched Babylon Berlin on Netflix. If you haven't, I strongly recommend it. It takes place in the period of Weimar Germany, and it's a political murder mystery series. But what's interesting there is that they demonstrate these different right-wing tendencies, all of which had been encouraged, influenced by the Weimar, the Versailles Treaty, and had their different ideas about Germany. The Nazis were one particular trend. So we have fascists within this right-wing populist milieu. We have others that are not. I think that Trump has become a fascist over time. And in that he is looking for, in a very non-ideological way, a destruction of constitutional democracy, but he's not quite sure what to replace it with. And so maybe fascistic, I'm not quite sure. But the major point that you were raising that I really agree with is that the mainstream media has tended to discount the danger of the far right, whether it's white Christian nationalism, whether it's other forms of right-wing populism or whatever. They've tended to look at it all as marginal trends. And that's very, very dangerous. And this is one of the things that we have to be talking with our members about, because many of our members, truth be told, are influenced by varying tendencies within right-wing populism.
Thank you.
Amy, you're next, followed by John.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you all. Hello, Bill. Welcome to our Connecticut Ether space.
Good to see you.
And we're all exhausted from doing legislative crap this week, but hey, we're a blue trifecta, and we still have to work so damn hard. Hey, I was really interested in your description of working with the right wing in the Sahara, Morocco. So, yeah, so a lot of us understand the world, the country today as a united front. You know, it's kind of all of us, and it's a very big all against them, right? And it's very broad. So I'm wondering if in a situation such as you're working with these Republicans, is this maybe a way to help foment cracks in the right wing?
Great question. Yes, the short answer is yes. I mean, there's certain forces on the right I simply will not work with. I will not work with fascists. There's a tendency that's called the Red-Brown Alliance that was a reference in the 1920s and 30s, and then after the end of the Cold War, where some radicals on the left were willing to work with fascists against globalization. Very, very dangerous. I won't work with fascists. But yes, we have to find ways of splitting the right. And that's why understanding that the right is not monolithic becomes incredibly important. Splitting off people like Liz Cheney and getting them to take stands against Trump. This is not something to dismiss. This is very, very important. I often give an example of from baseball. I'm a baseball fan. And I have for years wanted to get Curt Flood, who was a St. Louis Cardinals player, into the Hall of Fame. And I was talking with a group of people about building a campaign around this. And I said, if we're going to do this, the person we've got to win on this is George Will. Now, if you know anything about George Will, you know that he and I have about as much in common as I do with Attila the Hun. But George Will is a baseball fan, and in the context of baseball, is quite pro-union, right? And therefore, in this particular context, let's peel him off and unite with him. And that doesn't mean we have to agree with him on anything else. So that's where the issue of tactics becomes very important. Where can you unite with certain people around particular issues, and can you drive certain wedges? If you utilize Liz Cheney's antipathy to Trump, or Romney's antipathy towards Trump, can we use it? Doesn't mean we have to get in bed with them, but can we utilize that to create some splintering? And that's part of what we have to do. The right, I was going to say the right doesn't have to do it with us because we seem to just splinter on our own. But we can figure out a way of pulling it off. So yes, absolutely.
John, go ahead.
Hello, Bill. Just a question. Sort of get what you're saying. The right is not monolithic. But one of the questions I have is, over time, the left has been hollowed out, seems to have lost the capacity to offer, a true alternative to neoliberal capitalism. And I guess one of the questions I have is to sort of understand the sort of moment where we're in. I mean, it seems that we have to sort of take on board just the failure or the collapse of the left and the damage or the potential damage that has unleashed itself. Would you just comment on that, please?
Yeah, I agree. So let's start with a definition of terms, because it's very important. When I use the term left, I mean people anti-capitalists. I don't mean just people who are critical of capitalism. Then there's a broader spectrum of people I call progressive, and that includes the left, but it's not limited to the left. And these are people that are critical of the system and are looking for various forms of structural changes. We need both. And I think that you are absolutely right, John, that part of what happened, and I situate this going back to the era of Stalin, actually, is that much of the left in the advanced capitalist world ran out of ideas as to how to win power and what to do once in power. And then there was this fight over legitimacy. And so one of the things you start seeing in the 80s and certainly in the 90s were various forces on the left moving more and more to the right to become viewed as legitimate players, even when what was needed was a shift to the left. And I don't mean an ultra left. I'm not talking about purism. I mean a very deep critique of how this system is not only crushing people, but is destroying the planet. And that the solution to the environmental catastrophe of that the planet is facing is not recycling plastic bottles, with all due respect to recycling plastic bottles, which we do, right? But it's something more dramatic that really speaks to a change in the economy. But instead, you started to see the social democratic parties and the so-called communist parties moving more and more to the right, or they got stuck in the purest thing of basically saying, we're not going to shift to the right, we're going to continue to act as if this is 1930, right? And not recognizing that the way that the world has changed. And so I agree with you 100%. I think that what is necessary, I wrote a piece a few years ago that was called The Modern Tecumseh and the Future of the US Left, that deals with the need for a battle for what's called governing power. That is, that we need to, progressive forces need to fight to take over government and introduce transformational changes, structural changes. The kinds of changes that Jesse Jackson was talking about in 1988, that Bernie Sanders has been talking about, that when we run and win office, we've got to do more than manage a system in decline. And that is complicated because we're up against the banks. We're up against, when we're running and winning at the city level, we're up against state preemption, which the Republicans have been using all around the country to block changes at the municipal and county level, which means that ultimately we have to win control of states. The crisis in Jackson, Mississippi is not going to be resolved short of a change in the balance of power in the state of Mississippi. It's not going to be resolved in the city of Jackson by itself. And so we have to have a different approach to strategy. So I think, John, that all of these things are important, and articulating a different vision, not some purist utopian vision, but a different narrative about why people are getting their rear ends kicked and what needs to be done and what people can do. So we actually have to lay out that something can be done. This is part of the problem in the environmental movement, that when you basically present the extent of the crisis, it's very easy for people to decide, this is too overwhelming, therefore it can't be happening. Or this is too overwhelming, therefore there's nothing I can do other than get high, right? And so what we have to be saying is that, yes, it is overwhelming, but there's things that need to be done that we can do. And some of those are protests, like around the Keystone Pipeline. Some of those are what we can do if we take over office. And in taking over office, we have to realize that there will be counterattacks, that the right and liberals are going to get very nervous about some of the things that we're talking about, which means that we have to have a hell of a lot of mass support. And we have to also, let me put it like this. The right can be corrupt and they can make mistakes, and that doesn't panic people in the middle. If the left spends an extra $10 buying pizza for a meeting that it shouldn't have spent, the middle panics and is ready to throw the left out. And so we have to be really careful, because people on the left are not going to be able to win this battle by themselves. We have to think in majoritarian terms.
Bill?
Bill, you're muted.
He's getting there.
Which is yeah, I'm getting there. Yeah, which is it's a generational thing. Your description of the formation of the new right, reminds me that even today, we have the Koch industry network, right, that own the majority of fossil fuel production in the country, maybe the world. I think actually the world, who are libertarians. They're pro-abortion, pro-immigration. Are likely atheists. How they have partnered with the so-called social conservatives, the religious right, in order to further their agenda, right, under Trump, which was, massive tax breaks and deregulation and so forth. That was one thing that we kind of see today. The other thing that's sort of a paradox that we face here in Connecticut, as Amy says, we're a blue trifecta. And yet, when it comes to fighting back against the right, and I'm talking about the Connecticut Business and Industry Association, the Yankee Institute, which is a far right-wing think tank that sets the agenda for all our politics. It's what everyone is responding to, is right, their agenda of austerity and so forth. That we have this paradox where we spend day to day fighting centrist Democrats, because we want to fighting for over governing power, right? At the same time, we have to unite with them to keep the Republicans out. So I was wondering if you can comment on that.
Yeah, so one point is we have to always keep in mind that the Democrats are not a political party. They're an alliance, as is the Republican Party. And I've actually been saying to people, we should start referring to the Democratic Party as a Democratic Party alliance, because it will remind us that it's not a political party in the way that most of the rest of the world thinks of political parties. It, as my friend Carl Davidson points out, the Democratic Party contains within it at least 4 different parties, and they happen to be called caucuses. And in another country, we would have several different, in a parliamentary system, we'd have several different political parties that are all contained within the Democrats. So that's point one that's critically important at the level of strategy, to understand it's an alliance, it's a block, and there's going to be contention within that block. The second thing to keep in mind is something that the late premier of China, Zhou Enlai, once said about negotiations. He said he always went into negotiations with one hand out in friendship, and in the other hand, he had a gun. Yeah, I think it's really important to understand that there's always struggle involved in negotiations, and that when you're going and interacting with these centrist Democrats, for instance, they are friends under specific conditions, but you also have to be willing to struggle against them and not submit. But you have to assess the conditions. This is where tactics become very, very important. It's not about levels of principle, it's about a tactical assessment. Because one of the things which relates to my next point is that liberals are very fearful of the left, except under circumstances when the liberals think that repression coming down on the left may ultimately come down on them. So in that sense, they fear what the left may do in power. And we have to always keep that in mind. And they often think that the right can be controlled. And so it goes back to the notion of the right not being monolithic, that they think, as people did in the 2016 election, before Trump became dominant, there was an assessment among many liberals about to one degree or another, how they could cut a deal ultimately with any of these Republicans if they came out on top outside of Trump. That's what the assumption is. And that was what the assumption was when Hitler became the chancellor, that many folks thought that Hitler could never be as bad as his rhetoric was.
Mhm.
They turned out to be fundamentally wrong. So keeping in mind that, that many of these centrists are fearful of us, you always keep that in mind when you're going into working with them, that when they can, they will separate themselves from us, even when we're in a common front against the right. And so we always have to be watching them carefully. It doesn't mean you don't deal with them, but you keep that third eye open at all times. And I think one of the mistakes that some folks make is either trusting. See, I'm with Reagan on all of this. Trust but verify, right? It's like I'm prepared to trust anybody, but I'm going to be watching them very carefully to determine what they're going to do. Are they going to duck and run? Are they going to stab me in my back? Or are they going to be there with me in the fight? That's what we have to always do in every battle when you're building an alliance.
Well, thank you so much. It looks like all the hands are down and it's 7:15. I'm not sure if Bill or Waynette wants to wrap us up.
Yes, I want to say thank you, Mr. Bill Fletcher Jr. This was very enlightening. The Diversity Committee thanks you for bringing your presentation to our members here at 4Cs. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you all very much.
Have a great night. Bye, everybody.
Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.